Welcome. My name is Tim McRae. I'm the Vice President for Energy and Environment for the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. I'm going to jump us right in to questions for our esteemed panel. And I'm going to start with Senator Pavley. So Senator Pavley, your name is synonymous with California climate action. If you could share with us the broad sketch of the major climate bills that you authored, including AB 1493, AB 32, and SB 32. And if you could also describe Governor Brown's executive order on carbon neutrality and Senator De Leon's SB 100, how do those laws provide a broad framework to set California up to meet our climate goals?
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to the Silicon Valley Leadership Group for inviting me. And it's probably appropriate that I bring the historical perspective into all this discussion. You've mentioned three bills in particular: 1493, the tailpipe emission bill, AB 32, and SB 32. All share complementary policies in reducing climate pollutants and also the co-benefit of reducing criteria air pollutants. Creating this market for clean energy, whether in vehicles or buildings or appliances, fuels, or in clean renewable energy for our homes and businesses, all work together in the best interests of the economy and the environment. It was about 20 years ago that Senator Scheer introduced a bill that required our first renewable energy standards, portfolio standards. It was very controversial. 20% reduction, 20% of all electricity would come from clean renewable sources, and that followed the energy crisis. Don't let a good crisis go to waste. It's the lessons learned from that. I had introduced in my freshman year a tailpipe emission bill. I thought it would be very simple. You just reduce greenhouse gas emissions along with criteria air pollutants, and that would do our fair share in reducing climate pollutants, because as you know, mobile sources are a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Well, they both passed together. There was strong opposition. These were called job killer bills back then. That could we actually create clean energy policies that were good for the environment and good for the economy? And we proved that you could. And I want to thank Silicon Valley Leadership Group because they were here along the way with us on this journey. 3, interestingly enough, became a good model in that 14 other states adopted these standards. So California is a laboratory, if you will, for good clean energy policies, good for the environment, good for the economy, and other states are watching. AB 32 was signed into law by Governor Schwarzenegger back in 2006. And this put in the first multi-sector approach to unenforceable target, to put a cap on emissions, and a strong market signal and innovation in clean technologies. He's been a tremendous leader on this journey. In addition to the Clean Car Law and AB 32, the Renewable Portfolio Standard under the jurisdiction of the PUC, a low carbon fuel standard, energy efficient standards for appliances and buildings from the CEC sponsorship, they all work together to reduce emissions. Cap and trade was part of it, but I wanted to be clear to you because it sometimes confuses our viewers and listeners that cap and trade was about a 20% reduction, sort of a backstop, if you will, or a floor pricing signal that generated revenue through allowances from polluters for legislators to spend in the state or in the district to reduce emissions. It was important at that time, particularly, to address this because the federal government was watching. The Waxman Markey bill was being discussed. Businesses wanted a flexible, market-based compliance system to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that's what cap and trade brought us. Our state now also has, you had mentioned SB 100 by Senator De Leon, who I had the pleasure of serving with, was built on Senator Scheer and Senator Simitian's good works over the years. We are now getting closer to that 100% goal of clean electricity. We're over 50%, some cities over 60, 70%. So we don't always wait on the state. We actually include local governments in this discussion here in the clean energy future. We are going to, in the future though, be looking at offshore wind, pump hydro, and other things to accelerate getting to the SB 100 targets of 100% clean renewable energy. SB 32 passed in 2016. I kept the same numbers so I could remember them, but SB 32 just built on and extended AB 32 to a 40% reduction by 2030. That's what we're focused on now in Sacramento. How do we reach our 2030 targets? Frankly, we're going to need a lot of work to do that in the next 8.5 years. How do we accelerate strategies that are already on the board? How do we develop new strategies, whether it's in nature-based solutions or other energy and storage combinations? And also with SB 32, it's combined with Eduardo Garcia's, Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia's SB 197, which put in transparency and equity and environmental justice in our climate policies. So we have a lot of work to do. I look forward to working with all of you collectively and look forward to our discussion here today.
Thank you, Senator Pavley. That was an excellent historical overview. So let's turn to some of the efforts that people have identified of what we need to work on now. And I'll start with Senator Cortese. So you've introduced a bill package on building decarbonization. Why focus on buildings, and how do these bills fit in the context that Senator Pavley just outlined?
Well, thanks for the question. Thanks for having me here. And thanks for the leadership of the leadership group to convene and make sure that we're talking about and maintaining solidarity in this effort. I think that's important, really important. And we see that in the legislature. And I think we'll continue to see that in the future, how important it is for us who know that this work needs to be done to stick together. The building decarbonization, in terms of answering the question, is not is only one part of the issue, and the issue is tailpipe emissions, as we just heard Senator Pavley talk about, the history of that work, the history of other work that has set the stage, at the CEC in the state of California, other places for us to be moving toward the targets that we need to hit by 2030, really did not focus on the 30 to 60% of emissions that can be reduced, for example, in single family homes. And one of the things that I think is worrisome, to say the least, in the midst of a crisis, is that when we build buildings, when we build structures, when we build homes, like the 600,000 that are targeted in the Bay Area alone, based on the Plan Bay Area plan, they're around for a long time. And so how we build and equip those homes is going to establish and lock us into a carbon footprint on those buildings, in all likelihood for a long, long time. These are buildings, shelf life or functional obsolescence, if you want to look at it that way, is much, much different than phasing out automobiles or doing some of the things that we can do more immediately, I think, in terms of tailpipe emissions. So it's both and, it's all of the above. I know Assemblymember Ting has focused very much also, in a number of areas on, in terms of reducing emissions, in terms of net zero strategies, including buildings as well. He and I both kind of launched efforts at the beginning of this session, but we have a long way to go. We have a long way to go in the legislature to get complete buy-in on the strategy.
So that leads to the opportunity of my follow-up, which is, what are the barriers to the passage of this bill package? PG&E has indicated they're okay with switch to electric, but SoCalGas is dug in against. How will you overcome this opposition?
That opposition is serious, but it should be in no way the ultimate obstacle to getting this work done. It can't be. Let's face it, we're either in a crisis or we're not. If we're not, then we're all wasting our time pushing forward legislation, and that's, as we know, and I think everyone on this call knows, is not the case. This is a crisis, but there are powerful opposition forces on the one hand, but PG&E, for example, has shown some willingness to embrace, especially building decarbonization. I think the biggest obstacle that we have right now, and I'd be interested if others have seen this to the same extent, is that while we've started to get very detailed, and maybe I should say continue to be very detailed when I listen to the historical context from Senator Pavley about what we need to do in terms of the actual climate legislation, we have not been equally detailed in terms of workforce transition and corporate transition. And that scares the heck out of people. And in addition, I mean, this is California. When people make those demands, you know, those are demands that are consistent with most of the values that people hold dear in terms of our colleagues, our peers in the legislature. It's not as if you have a legislature that wants to sort of blow off workforce transition issues and just say, you know, damn the torpedoes full speed ahead. You have a legislature that in large part has been espousing those values for years and years and years, only to realize we really haven't established the metrics that really would spell out either in companion legislation or embedded in the legislation that we're bringing forward now, that if we want to go fast on things like electrification, we need to go equally fast in terms of answering the questions about how that's done without displacing people, jobs, corporate entities, and so on and so forth. So we have our work cut out for us, but I think the good news is we know what it is.
Yes, a lot of work to do there. And we're happy to partner with you on those solutions. The question that I have, just one last follow-up on building decarbonization. Do you think that we will need incentives as well to get businesses and individuals to make the switch to all electric buildings and appliances? And in particular, I know there are people who just wrap their loving arms around their natural gas ranges. What are we going to do to be able to get people to not love their natural gas stoves so much and make the transition to electric?
Yeah, you know, the bills that we introduced, the package that you referred to earlier, SB 30, 31, and 32, really covered a gamut of different areas. But SB 31 really focused on that issue that you just brought up. You know, how to use grant programs, which the state has is very good at, really. How do you expand those grant programs, not just in terms of dollars available, but in terms of rewarding the kind of behavior you want in terms of building decarbonization. I think we'll see that. SB 31 is a 2-year bill, and in large part because as we were able to get into positive and productive negotiations with folks that were concerned about the guardrails around that, you know, we had a number of amendments in place, but not enough, you know, to get in and out of the process before January. So we'll keep working on that. But, you know, I think that we need to bring, you know, residential home builders who know their markets, who understand how far they can go without, you know, defeating their own competitiveness in markets. For example, on things like gas stoves, we need to understand what, if technology is coming along that are basically going to replicate the gas stove in a form that will allow people to have what they like, you know, in terms of that flexibility, you know, when it comes to just the basic qualities of life of being able to turn your dial up and down on a moment's notice while you're cooking and so forth. Those are things that I think we make it more imperative than ever that we bring groups in like the California Building Industry Association collaboratively with the building trades, with environmental interests, and say, you know, how much can we do right now without getting ourselves caught up in what I call the overnight syndrome, where, you know, we say we got to do everything overnight, whether we're ready to do it or not. I think that's going to be the mistake of the century if we go down that path. We don't do what the legislature is actually very good at, is taking chunks, taking sort of yardage, to use a football analogy, in big chunks, but not necessarily trying to go all the way down the field, you know, with one piece of legislation. You know, that hardly ever works, as we heard from the history of the past. Great legislation was done, but it was iterative legislation as well.
Great, thank you for that. And let me bring in Assemblymember Ting. Good morning, Assemblymember Ting. So you're the Assembly Budget Chair. Can you describe the climate aspects of the budget package that was approved last week? What will this package include to help us meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals? And where will we need to put more funding down the road?
Thanks for that question. I think this is a really very exciting budget year. We started off being very pessimistic on how this budget would look and ended up with a huge surprise and a very significant surplus. One of our major priorities is to go reduce our greenhouse gas impacts. We've been fighting for a number of priorities in a variety of fronts. I'll just give you some kind of broad examples of sort of what we're looking at. In terms of advancing clean energy, we're looking at spending almost $1 billion over 2 years. For example, you mentioned incentives, $75 million to build resilient homes that are all electric or have energy storage, $20 million in grants for local governments to streamline rooftop solar, $735 million for long duration storage, green hydrogen, research and development in the hardest to decarbonize sectors, and energy efficiency as well for our largest energy consumers, $72 million for zero carbon grid planning. So that just gives you a sense of what we're doing in clean energy. In terms of outdoor access, we are putting $460 million to build new parks statewide and expand existing parks, which really will encourage people to be outdoors and hopefully to really respect our environment. We did an earlier drought package and water package, but we anticipate that we will be doing more. $1.3 billion for drinking water and wastewater infrastructure, $100 million for responding to fisheries and wildlife, $85 million for recycled water, $1 billion to help pay off water debt. So it's a huge and robust package. I don't want to go into the details for our ZEV package, but we will be doing, obviously, building on the governor's announcement. I was proud to introduce legislation a number of years ago banning new gas cars as of 2040. Was very excited to see the governor issue his executive order, and we'll be announcing in the next day a pretty robust zero emission vehicle package that will really help move us much closer to that goal of 2035, no new gas cars by 2035. In terms of wildfire, obviously, given how hot it is this week, in the next few weeks, we are very worried about wildfires, but we're doing $1 billion above the already $500 million we invested. A significant amount of that's going to go toward vegetation management and just really preventative measures. We have $776 million for sustainable agriculture. And then for climate resilience, we're looking at $3.7 billion over 3 years. We were looking at doing a climate bond and realized we actually don't need to do a climate bond because we have enough money this year to do many of the adaptation projects as well as responding to sea level rise issues in the Bay this year. So we are going to be looking at doing a significant investment toward climate adaptation and climate resilience. So that just gives you some of the highlights that we're looking at.
Excellent, thank you for that. A question for all of you. The Silicon Valley Leadership Group was the first business group to endorse AB 32. We also lobbied for SB 32 and SB 100. And in your experience, passing major environmental legislation, working on these very big issues now that Senator Cortese mentioned, workforce transition, lots in the budget that we've supported, what is the importance of the business voice in passing landmark environmental legislation?
You know, it's huge. It's extremely important. We cannot afford, to have anything less than full collaboration the rest of the way here. It is a little concerning that over this first year of this current session, we have seen some polarization, and I'm not laying that at the doorstep of business per se. I'm talking about the major interests and stakeholders out there that need to come together on this environmental legislation seemingly have moved in opposite directions, and we can't afford that. We can't afford that to happen. It's just a timing issue at this point. I think we're all here because we know we need to turn this around on behalf of humanity. In the state of California, up till now has been leading the globe, in in this effort, especially during the Trump years. We were it as far as the United States of America, and we need to continue that pace. So yes, we need business support. We need your convening powers. We need your sensibilities and pragmatism, and we need your help, convincing others to move forward with us.
Yeah, I'll just add to Senator Cortese. I think it's extremely important that SVLG, all the business groups are really there at the table. We're going through a major fight, as Senator Cortese framed, in terms of a transition. And I'll just be very frank. I mean, the fossil fuel industry is very powerful in Sacramento, and they are fighting to prolong that transition as long as possible. And so when you have like-minded business leaders who say that we really need to protect our earth, protect our environment in California, and that we need to hasten that transition from fossil fuels into cleaner energy, it makes a huge statement. Obviously, everyone always assumes the environmental groups are going to be on board. And so when you bring other stakeholders to the table in terms of the business organizations, it sends a huge message. Last year, I was honored to pass AB 793, which is a bill that set the highest recycled content standards in the world. And that would not have been possible without partnering with the beverage industry and really working with them, finding realistic timelines, realistic goals, working with different recycled plastic manufacturers, making sure that realistically we could achieve what we were setting out. So it's huge. It's a huge impact when the business community comes to the table and really works with us to find solutions. Sometimes we have a lot of business groups in Sacramento, and their standard answer is just no. They don't come for solutions. They just come to block things. That's what I really appreciate about so many of the Bay Area business groups. It's a very different environment. We'll have very frank and honest discussions. But when we can get to yes, we have so many great organizations that work with us to get to yes. And that's why, I'm so proud to be part of our Bay Area community.
Let me just jump in on a historical perspective again. Broadening our coalition from just environmental support when I introduced the original 1493, the tailpipe emission bill, was absolutely critical to the passage of that, and made it so much easier when we got to AB 32. And it was that broadening the coalition, business leaders, absolutely critical. In fact, looking back, it was like a head of a new solar company who said to me, we're in California, not in spite of your policies, but because of your policies. Putting a cap on emissions opened up and created a market for us to succeed. I talked to someone who took over an old oil refinery and now creates aviation biofuels. He said, we moved from Washington to California because of your policies. So businesses can really tell the story, along with that really important piece of it that Dave Cortese mentioned earlier on, in how we develop that workforce transition to this new economy. How do we streamline that and making the jobs we want people to have, and having California really focus on the supply chain, having that in state as well, I think is going to be absolutely critical. So the business voice was important. And the other voice that came about from our beginning efforts were all the healthcare providers, or the American Lung Association, or even California Medical Association was engaged in our early work, the nurses and everyone else, because the link between climate change and health impacts is something that the public is very concerned about, and they understand and they get. Air districts, water districts, the link to droughts and everything. And now those of you in office have to do a lot more work than we did 20 years ago. And that's not only to mitigate emissions, but the adaptation strategies with the accelerating impacts of climate change that are affecting our lives, whether it's through wildfires and droughts. All these are important issues, and they have to work together. But we have a lot of important things to do. And the last thing you want to do is ignore the problem, because that would be the worst thing we could do for the environment, but also the economy.
Well said. And on the question of adaptation, I know that the San Francisco Bay needs more wetlands built to restore the bay and to reduce rising waters there. I know that Assemblymember Ting, you've been a leader to put in the budget $300 million legislative proposal for wetlands restoration, which we support, and we'd love to continue working with you on that. We've got about 1 minute left. I'll just ask the last question. California sees itself as a model for action on climate. What have we done successfully, and what do we need federal and international leaders to solve? This is kind of the state level panel with lots of other panelists on federal and international issues. What's the one thing that we need that they can answer that we can't?
Well, just really quickly, I think you see President Biden leading on transportation. Transportation is almost 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions here in California. You see his climate infrastructure package. Transportation is very key, whether it's public transportation or clean transportation in terms of vehicles. And so I think that's going to be a major help when he can get that across the table. We are doing our part in California, but we've really needed the leadership from Washington on that issue.
I would agree. I think it's that straightforward, especially coming off the Trump years, and that's not a partisan statement. That's the fact of the matter is we were pulled out of the Paris Accords. The leadership was going in a different direction. It set us back. It forced advocates, from the United Nations all the way down to work county by county and city by city because there was no other way to work. Now we have the federal government in a position to help us with many of the things that we were just talking about, including opposition, and that's really important.
When I think of how the federal government could help, because that's been one of our challenges, we thought all our policies were just going to be models or California becoming a laboratory for federal policies. And here we are 20 years later, waiting on that. So at the top of my list would be interstate commerce, whether it's electrification, shifting off diesel trucks and the goods movement. That's a huge environmental justice issue, as well as everything else. We need the federal government. Aviation, we can do in-state biofuels and reduce the carbon intensity of aviation fuels, but we need a federal and global cooperation on that. And we're seeing more and more evidence with our ports and everything else and good movements of maritime ships and how we address climate change. So the price of the infrastructure, as well as the leadership in Washington, is absolutely critical. And other states are starting to work together, and cities are engaged in climate action plans that maybe are going to be helpful to you in Sacramento and Washington, D.C. in moving us in the right direction.
Great. Thank you each for your public service as elected officials, and thanks for participating in today's panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.